The moment the WNBA finally broke through, it turned on itself, and that contradiction is the real story nobody in power wants to explain. After decades of fighting for relevance, fighting for airtime, fighting for legitimacy, the league at last crossed into a new era where fans didn't have to be begged, sponsors didn't have to be convinced, and television executives didn't have to be guilted into caring. The numbers arrived first, then the crowds, then the noise, and finally the undeniable truth: women's basketball had found its engine. But instead of celebrating that arrival, the people who had waited the longest for success reacted as if it were being stolen from them. What should have been a moment of alignment became a moment of resistance. The league didn't stall because it lacked money or momentum, it stalled because it lacked unity, and that fracture ran straight through veteran leadership that had spent years defining the WNBA as a struggle rather than a product. When growth finally appeared, they didn't know how to share it without losing control of the narrative. That tension sat quietly for months, disguised as normal labor talks, until it exploded into a full freeze that exposed how fragile the league's internal politics really were. Free agency didn't stop because negotiations were close, it stopped because both sides were speaking entirely different languages about what success even means. Fans saw sold-out arenas, record ratings, and cultural relevance that women's basketball had never enjoyed before. Leadership saw spreadsheets, caution flags, and a fear that the spotlight had shifted too fast, too far, and toward players who hadn't paid their dues in the traditional sense. That fear poisoned the room. The argument stopped being about sustainability and started being about ownership of credit. Veteran voices insisted the league's rise was the result of years of sacrifice, grind, and invisible labor, and while that history matters, it couldn't explain the sudden scale of attention now flooding in. This wasn't slow growth. This was ignition. And ignition doesn't care about seniority. It responds to electricity. The audience didn't show up because of abstract progress or institutional loyalty, they showed up because something finally felt urgent, exciting, and modern. New fans didn't memorize old resumes or championship banners before buying tickets. They followed energy, personalities, rivalries, and moments that cut through the noise of every other sports option competing for attention. That reality made some people deeply uncomfortable, because it meant the league was no longer controlled by legacy alone. It was being shaped in real time by demand. When the Players Association pushed for massive financial leaps framed as moral necessity, they weren't just asking for money, they were asserting authority over the future narrative of the league. And when the league office pushed back, it wasn't just about expenses, it was about survival strategy in a business that had never experienced this kind of spotlight before. The result was paralysis. Phones stopped ringing. Agents ran out of answers. Expansion teams sat frozen with empty boards. Players with expiring contracts stared into uncertainty while social media buzzed with confusion and anger. What made the situation combustible wasn't just the freeze, it was the timing. You don't pause a product the moment it catches fire unless you don't trust what's fueling it. That's why Sophie Cunningham's reaction landed like a spark in gasoline. When she openly mocked the process and called it dumb, it wasn't disrespect, it was clarity. She voiced the frustration of players trapped between public success and private dysfunction. Weekly emails replaced real progress. Meetings replaced movement. Language replaced action. The league's greatest opportunity in decades was being managed with the same caution it used when no one was watching. Fans could feel it slipping. Momentum is fragile. Attention is impatient. Audiences that discover a sport don't wait forever for administrators to catch up. They move on. And that's what made the shutdown feel less like a negotiation tactic and more like self-sabotage. The WNBA had finally reached a moment where belief outpaced doubt, where excitement outpaced skepticism, and instead of protecting that breakthrough, the league allowed internal fear and ego to freeze it in place. This wasn't a labor dispute in the abstract. It was a referendum on whether the people steering the league actually trusted the future they claimed to have built. Because when success arrived wearing a new face, louder energy, and unfamiliar power, the response wasn't confidence, it was control. And control, in a moment like this, is how growth dies. The fight over money became the battlefield, but money itself was never the real weapon, it was the excuse. What sat underneath the spreadsheets and percentages was a raw power struggle over who gets to define value in a league that had suddenly become valuable. The Players' Association walked into negotiations armed with momentum, convinced that public excitement alone guaranteed leverage, and demanded a revenue split that treated the WNBA like a fully matured empire rather than a league still laying its foundation. On paper, the demands sounded bold, even righteous: higher caps, unprecedented salary jumps, and a share of revenue calculated before the league paid for the very systems that allowed games to exist. But boldness without realism turns quickly into brinkmanship. The league's response wasn't generosity, it was survival math. Officials argued that growth without guardrails is how leagues collapse under their own weight, especially ones expanding travel, adding franchises, funding charters, and trying to lock in long-term media deals that depend on stability. That clash exposed something uncomfortable. The boom everyone was celebrating hadn't yet translated into the kind of financial cushion people were pretending already existed. Fans saw headlines about record ratings and packed arenas and assumed the vault was overflowing. Inside the boardrooms, the picture was messier. Revenue doesn't equal profit. Buzz doesn't equal sustainability. And yet the union's leadership kept pushing as if hesitation itself were betrayal. That rigidity turned negotiation into stalemate. Each side accused the other of bad faith while inching further apart. Players waiting on contracts became collateral damage. Expansion teams with millions invested watched their launch plans evaporate. Agents stopped negotiating because there was nothing left to negotiate. The freeze wasn't accidental, it was the inevitable result of two visions of the league crashing into each other. One vision believed the WNBA had already arrived and deserved to be paid like it. The other believed arrival meant nothing if the structure collapsed 6 months later. And hovering over that argument was a more explosive question no one wanted to answer out loud: why now? Why push the hardest line in the exact moment when new stars were driving unprecedented attention? Why risk public goodwill at the peak of momentum? For many fans, the answer felt obvious. This wasn't just about securing fair compensation, it was about reasserting authority in a league where influence was shifting faster than leadership was comfortable with. The surge in popularity didn't elevate everyone equally, and resentment crept into the conversation disguised as principle. When veteran leaders insisted that years of sacrifice mattered more than immediate impact, they weren't wrong, but they were also missing the point. Sports don't reward tenure, they reward relevance. The market doesn't care who suffered the longest, it responds to who moves it now. By refusing to acknowledge that reality, the negotiations stopped being about fairness and started being about denial. The longer the freeze dragged on, the clearer it became that this wasn't a temporary impasse, it was a test of whether the league could adapt to its own success. Every silent week chipped away at trust. Fans didn't see responsible caution, they saw missed opportunity. Players didn't see strategic patience, they saw leadership willing to gamble with their careers. And as frustration grew, the most dangerous thought of all took root: if the WNBA couldn't capitalize on its moment, someone else would. That idea lingered in the background of every stalled email and every cancelled call, quietly transforming a labor dispute into an existential threat. Because once a league proves it can't move forward when the spotlight is brightest, the spotlight doesn't wait, it shifts. The consequences of that paralysis didn't stay trapped in emails and boardrooms, they spilled into the real world fast, and once fans felt it, there was no walking it back. Refunds started quietly, then loudly, then publicly, as season ticket holders and first-time buyers alike realized the league they had just embraced was willing to risk their loyalty over internal pride. The backlash wasn't manufactured outrage, it was organic disappointment from people who finally believed and suddenly felt shut out. Social timelines filled with anger, confusion, and one question that kept repeating: how do you freeze a league at the exact moment it catches fire? In cities where attendance had exploded, the mood flipped overnight. Bars that had planned watch parties hesitated. Sponsors who had just signed on started asking uncomfortable questions. The league's growth wasn't theoretical anymore, it was woven into local economies, fan routines, and cultural momentum, and the freeze ripped through all of it. While leadership argued over percentages, players began making moves. Not symbolic moves. Real ones. Lucrative ones. The most damaging part wasn't even the exits, it was the optics. While the Players Association publicly framed itself as fighting for players, its own leaders were tied to outside ventures offering exactly what the WNBA couldn't deliver during the freeze: clarity, movement, and vision. Fans noticed. Players noticed. Trust eroded. What had once been sold as solidarity started to look like fragmentation, and fragmentation is deadly for a league still building its identity. Meanwhile, the new stars, the very players driving the surge, were left stuck in neutral, unable to build on their momentum, unable to plan, unable to capitalize on the moment they had created. That's the quiet damage no balance sheet shows. Windows don't stay open forever. Audiences are ruthless. Attention moves on. If the league fails to act while people care, it won't get the same chance twice. This isn't about choosing sides between veterans and newcomers, it's about choosing the future over fear. The WNBA reached a crossroads where it had to decide whether growth would be embraced or controlled, whether relevance would be nurtured or negotiated into irrelevance. Fans have already cast their vote with their wallets, their voices, and their patience. They want momentum, not gridlock. Progress, not pride. And if the league